Hello, welcome to another episode of Encrypted Minds. My name is Edwin Carlos, and today I have a very interesting guest, Noah Landow of Macktez, and I'm very pleased that you're here on the show with on the podcast Encrypted Minds, Noah. Um, During just the preparation, we shared some ideas, and I love your view on how you approach your customer needs. So this is something we're going to discuss during the next hour. But thanks again for being in the show. Please introduce yourself to the people who don't know you yet.
Absolutely. I'm Noah Landow. I have a company with a business partner and a great team in New York called Macktez. It's actually Macktez. People often misunderstand and think it's something Mac OS related, but it's not. It's actually my mother's maiden name. It's a family thing. But Macktez has been around for coming up on 30 years. I was shocked to realize. And we've been in New York. We had at various points offices in London and in San Francisco, but now we're mostly in New York, and as many things are these days, sort of remote and distributed. And we are a technology consulting firm. Our organization does work which is traditionally called MSP, which is sort of like managed service provider work, which is sort of like outsourced IT taking care of technology, and also what is typically called technology consulting, which is sort of figuring out how to solve technology problems for organizations. Sometimes we do both of those together and sometimes separately. We also have a small group that does physical installation work, like building out offices and conferencing and that kind of stuff. So that combination of all those things together, we've been doing for organizations that are especially kind of value driven. A lot of organizations are nonprofits, are creative companies in the arts world, sometimes startups. So we like to say that we don't really have a particular vertical of sort of industry that we worked with as much as sort of the culture that we're looking for. Something we talk about a lot. I actually had a conversation with my director of client services about this yesterday, is this idea of sort of collaborative IT that really when we're approaching our relationships with clients, it's tempting to think of IT as sort of a box that has sort of clear delineation at the beginning and the end. But really, a lot of the things that are kind of part of successfully using technology in an organization and managing it over the long term really is sort of blends and flows into other departments, people experience or HR, and into finance and into ops. And so we try not to let IT be kind of like boxed up into a little tiny character, a little tiny kind of, sort of stereotype of sort of like, oh, it just does these things, and think of our relationship to the technology and our relationship to the client as more collaborative. Practical terms, what that also means is figuring out what often means is what kind of comes down to who does what. There's sometimes a person standing right there next to the person we're talking to who can change the toner, and so instead of being super strict about whether it's us or them or you or who, kind of have that be an open conversation that kind of adjusts based on the resources and capabilities and headspace of the culture. That also allows us to work with organizations of a pretty broad range of sizes, up to maybe 1,000 people. We have organizations where there's a 20+ person IT department that we collaborate with, and then organizations in which there's no IT department of any kind. We function entirely as one. So that kind of variability is unusual in our space, and sometimes people squint a little and they're like, how does that work? But I think thinking of that as collaborative, I think is a helpful framing mechanism to see the common threads throughout all of those dynamics.
Yeah, interesting. You mentioned a couple of things. First of all, you're a veteran in the market. If you compare to other IT services companies, you have a certain legacy, but also some background. But still adapting to new technologies, new evolutions of our business. For example, you mentioned it already: hiring remote people, using new technologies. How can you adopt? How do you do this?
Yeah, I think that there's a few different kind of key characteristics. And just to define terms a little bit, when you say veteran, you mean a seasoned person that's been doing this for a while and a company that's been in this for a while, not a military veteran. In this context,
Thank you for this. Yeah, thank you. I'm just making the direct translation, but it's
absolutely it's a tiny English nuance that is probably lost outside of the States. I wouldn't want somebody to think I was a vet because I am not. But in that context, the series of technology kind of eras over those 29 years have been quite varied. Obviously, there are elements that have had sort of commonalities between those periods, but there have been a great variety of challenges and a great variety of opportunities presented by different eras of technology. we could obviously spend the entire hour talking about kind of waxing poetic about the different decades and the different quartiles. But really, I think to sort of simplify and give you a slightly less wandering answer, I think the lesson ultimately is that the technology is a sort of a central tentpole of approach for us and has certainly served me as an individual well. The technology itself isn't really terribly interesting or frankly, all that important. What we're really interested in is what it does for people, how it works. In our early days, that was something that we talked about from a user interface design. The approach was, technology, we approach it like it's a user interface problem, not a technology problem, meaning it doesn't matter if the software does everything you want if you can't use it comfortably and if people can't figure out how to use it. But if the tools work smoothly and effectively and people are comfortable and happy using them, then even if the technology isn't cutting edge and isn't super fancy, it can still be very effective and still have a fantastic positive effect on the organization. That comes up in a lot of conversations in terms of, somebody is using this particular file storage system, and the way that the files and the folders and the sharing are structured isn't really a technological limit. There are, of course, factors to that, but often there's a plethora of ways that system could be kind of designed and conceived and structured. And whether that system is super frustrating or extremely sort of facile and easy and really well, works really well for them, often depends on sort of choices about how you configure. And a lot of those choices come down to kind of effective stakeholder conversations internally, getting people into the room and kind of like making sure that people who are actually using these tools have a voice in kind of what the systems and how they're configured. That's I think it's a fascinating world if you think of that over the course of 2 or 3 decades, because the particulars of that have changed so wildly from mobile devices. When we first began working, Windows was really in its sort of infancy. It was the mid-90s, and Windows 95 had just come out the year before. And so a lot of our clients were very Macintosh-based, but the Macintosh was a very, very different thing in the mid-90s than it is now. The idea of mobile devices and phones, even BlackBerries weren't common yet. When we first began working, actually, email wasn't even terribly common in the early 90s and mid-90s. So it's interesting to think back a little bit on like which of these tools, the internet, email, replacing faxing, replacing sending messengers with portfolios around. There's so many, even the idea of signatures. It's a very different world now in terms of things that we just default to assuming, oh, I can do that on a computer. Many of those things weren't on a computer then. And I think for me, at least, a lot of the pleasure and a lot of the joy in technology is sort of staying focused on like, well, how does it actually work for people? Like, does this actually help? Does it solve a problem that people have? And that, I often kind of comb around looking for different tools and technologies, and I'm like, oh, that's really interesting. That doesn't solve a problem I have, but it's sort of intellectually interesting. But I try not to let myself get too kind of fixated or fall down rabbit holes for things that are kind of like, without a problem to solve, and really look for what are the problems that people are having and how do we stay focused on those.
But still, after 30 years, as a seasoned entrepreneur in this space, you tend to understand or to investigate new tools, and that can also be part of your culture. Because what I've learned is that the background of your team, your hires, are not always engineering. They got a broad background from artistic backgrounds to completely different to different people. Is this something you can translate in the culture? Is it the something like human or a natural how do you say, need to investigate new tools and to see if it can fit with your customers? Yeah.
I think that there are certainly there's a component to Macktez's culture in which the people who are kind of drawn to work for us and the kind of work that we do tends to sort of collectively kind of be attractive to people who have a little more of a varied and disparate background.
Yes.
It's not that we won't work with people who have sort of an IT formal background, but my background, my degree is in architecture. My business partner, the COO of Macktez, is molecular biochemistry and biophysics. Our CTO has I think it's technically a mechanical engineering background, but not computers, but still engineering. Our director of client services has a background in literature. So quite a few of our team members, especially if we look back over the years, many of our team members have come from, if not creative in the traditional sense, at least varied backgrounds. whether molecular biophysics is creative or not, I think depends a little bit on who you talk to and what you think of when you think of the concept of creativity. I would argue that a lot of the sciences are highly creative, and a lot of engineering is as well. So from that perspective, I think we're really we're looking for individuals as a team who kind of look at a problem and think, how do I solve this? Not who look at a problem and say, well, I have a hammer and a screwdriver. Which of these tools do I use to solve that problem? And so that's an area where, again, that varies over time. And the number of people and the number of roles we're filling has, of course, shifted. What it means to do desktop support or end user support is very, very different now than it did a decade ago, or than it was a decade ago. And even the kind of tools that we're using to support clients and to plan, the difference in kind of fleet management tools. We use a product called Jump Cloud, which is an identity provider, but also has MDM and device management and asset management and a bunch of other kind of components built in. We use that a lot. It serves quite a few of our clients extremely well. And that's a great example of a kind of product that there wasn't anything like that 20 years ago. The entire concept was new.
And is this tool, if you just implement it within one customer, are you expanding it to other customers? Or is it the other way around? Is it a certain need that you recognize with your customers and then find a tool? How does it work within Macktez?
That's a great question. As I mentioned at the beginning, where there's sort of these two approaches, what I would call technology consulting and MSP work or managed services. Those two sort of typically have almost, if not diametrically, at least orthogonally opposed kind of visions of how you would approach an answer to the question you just asked. An MSP traditionally tries to solve all clients with the same stack of technology services and, frankly, as close to the same configuration as makes sense, or at least they would default to the same kinds of configuration. All of our clients have the default security policy or default update policy like this. A technology consultancy would often do the opposite. They would spend a lot of time trying to understand what the idiosyncrasies and peculiarities and special things of this particular client are, and then go find tools that are particularly well matched to that specific set of requirements. So for us, we kind of do a blend of those. Sometimes we come into a relationship or a conversation, and most of our relationships begin with a technical assessment, not surprisingly. And sometimes the outcome of that is, your needs are sufficiently kind of standard or straightforward or common that this pre-existing set of tools that we have, identity management, workstation management, essentials, core, this set of tools that we have bundled and configured and made a bunch of predefined sort of suggestions in terms of how you should use them, that's actually a good fit for you. Sometimes we have that conversation and that's not the case. And it's like, well, what we should actually probably do is build your own tenancy in Azure AD, and you should build your own tenancy in Intune or Jamf or some other tool set. And so we do both. I think we're a little unusual in that while we do have what I would call a default answer, we have hey, if you don't have some other reason to do something else, this is where we'll start in terms of this is a best practice. But we are quite open to sort of solving these problems in a myriad of different ways. And of course, some of that's the co-management. Sometimes we come into environments where there are some of the tool sets or the components in the tool set are working really well, and some are working less well. And that's an opportunity to say, hey, this piece is actually pretty good. I think we should keep that, but this piece is not working great. Why don't we come up with a better fix or a better solution or a better configuration for this? And sometimes we come into environments where nothing's working kind of the way anyone wants it. And then it's okay, tabula rasa, we can let's reset and let's come up with a new approach from scratch. But both of those are interesting, but different constraints, of course.
Yes, yeah, I see what you mean. So there is a reason I like to talk to entrepreneurs from the US or people from the US in general. They seem to be a couple of years ahead of us in Europe. I used, as you know, I work for big IT companies software companies from the US, and you see certain trends developing on your side. What eventually come to us. You mentioned, and you can just compare also the business needs from your customers from the past years, that you are transforming from an MSP with one formal stack of technology to more a blended mix of solutions, what also fit for your end customers. Is this a trend you see in a broader perspective in the US, or is it something you see with your customers?
It's interesting. Depending on when I answer that question, I might give you slightly different answers. I would have argued that 10 years ago, we were not an MSP at all. which was a little unusual. We really approached every single project and every single relationship as sort of like, okay, where should we start for this one? Over the last decade, maybe 15 years, depending on when you start counting and what you define as the anniversary. We do more things that are MSP related. The reason or the argument I would make to explain that transition is actually, it's not a direct answer to the question you're asking, but I think it's still an interesting answer, which is that the landscape of tools has evolved so radically over the last 10 to 20 years that there were many of these tools which were maybe an effective solution for very large organizations, but they were not effective for smaller organizations. And by that I mean, maybe you could use this tool set for 500 people really, really well, or you could use, Monkey or some other thing for a 10,000 seat environment, but trying to implement this suite of tools and this combination for 25 or maybe even 50 people was sort of slightly absurd, and the cost to manage that system wildly outstripped the benefits that you would get from it. Certainly, if you go the farther back you go, I think the larger the scale had to be for these sort of automated, centralized sort of like fleet management and identity management tools to be effective. But I think what's happened over that is what I sometimes call the sort of consumerification or SaaSification in the SaaS sense, not SaaS, SaaSification, which would be essentially this transition of a lot of these products went from something you bought and ran on a piece of equipment and configured yourself to essentially a very accessible product designed for somebody with minimal technical experience to provide a credit card, type in some information, and go. And some of that is an improved sophistication of the tools. The tools became cleverer and more capable of auto-configuring. Some of it is the world, I think, shifted. More of the underlying technologies that we rely on work better. I know that's sometimes a complicated thing to say, but I would argue that like if you buy a Macintosh or a Windows computer now and just use it for 5 years, it will generally keep working the entire time, sometimes even longer. But that wasn't the case in the 90s or even in the early aughts. You would have to run preventative maintenance. You would do various directory and defrag and all these other things that were necessary to keep the machine from running. Plus, updating software required manually doing a bunch of things that you had to remember to do and make a point of buying a piece of software and plugging it in. And of course, updates for most major operating systems are, if not entirely automated, largely automatic. Certainly the default is to automation and kind of continuous updates. So we're in a very different landscape in terms of how this mix of services are experienced by an end user, particularly an end user who hasn't decided that that's what they want their entire professional focus to be. So I would describe it as sort of the gifted amateur or the person who's like a CTO who's highly technical, but like their interest isn't really in managing fleets of machines. Their interest is in quantum computing or AI or building automated workflows that solve a real end user kind of product problem. So anyway, back to your actual question, I think a lot of what's happened is that the rich landscape of available opportunities mean that companies don't need to talk to a technology consultancy or an MSP at the smaller end of the scale. I think that's one of the larger interesting changes. A lot of startups, you can kind of go to a place, a website, and click a few buttons and give a credit card, and suddenly you have an LLC or an S corp, and then you can hit another couple of buttons and you have insurance, and you can have another couple of buttons and you have a domain name, and then on top of that a few more, and you have a website, and maybe a couple more, and you have email and collaborative document storage, and you can kind of keep adding these services at a relatively limited technical expertise required. A lot of the areas where we come in are organizations that started off that way and were very capably managed in their initial stages, but then have grown past the point where those sort of not super well informed, but perfectly reasonable choices aren't the right choices for a 200-person company or a 50-person company that expects to have explosive growth next year. So a big part of what we do, I think, is sort of try to understand, hey, you're at a point now where you should be doing some of these things a little differently, or you're at a point where it's time to kind of rethink some of these reasonable, but maybe not the right perfect choices. And again, some of what we do is we jokingly call tame the tech beast. It's like we come in and try to like untangle like what's happening under the hood here. Like if you make a change to this thing in the HR information system, what are the ramifications for this thing? And if you build in this piece and connect it here, do you have consensus internally that like these roles should have access to these resources? And do you all agree that these names mean the same thing to everybody? Is the taxonomy and word definitions of these kind of like HR roles understood by the managers so that when you grant that person access, you're granting the right person access to the right thing? Anyway, a lot of those are the, non-technological components of making these technologies work effectively in the real world.
Yeah. And is this also the changing culture, the changing business proposition of Macktez? Because from in the 90s, you need to maintain the desktops. That has changed. Everything seems to be working for a couple of years. Now you have to more be the director of certain technologies and keep it safe. It's also something to do maybe with the consumerization, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, from different tools. A lot of people bringing in their own tools in their own
Yes.
workflow. Like for example, ChatGPT is being used on a multitude of tasks.
Yes.
While it's out of control of the business itself.
Yep.
How do you see these kind of developments?
That is interesting. There's obviously there's trend lines. One of the trend lines you're referring to is often in this industry called shadow IT.
Yes.
And shadow IT is of course a bigger topic than just ChatGPT. But I think ChatGPT or Gemini or any of these other are a good example. We, for example, use Gemini, which is the AI tool that is included with our Google Workspace account that allows us to have some great controls and share things and kind of mediate some of that process. Many users are using ChatGPT or Perplexity or other tool sets are not doing that within the sort of like enterprise corporate kind of service mix. Shadow IT is an interesting, it's almost the dark underbelly of the kind of consumerification I described earlier. It essentially the barrier for entry for a kind of quote unquote random person, some person who has a need to solve that by going to a website and signing up is essentially kind of the other side of the person who does a startup and can just go. It's the person who works for your company who you would prefer maybe not to come up with like another file storage solution and set up a new Dropbox account, but nothing really prevents them from doing that in sort of traditional kind of open access systems. There are some very interesting things happening in the kind of managed service technology landscape. Certainly if you're 5 to 10 people, most of these tools are not an obvious fit, but if you're 100 or 500 or 1,000 people, one of the tools, for example, that JumpCloud uses, there's a bunch of other companies that have specialization in this space. SaaS management is a sort of an entire category, and that could mean a few different things. But one of the things that JumpCloud, for example, has a module, a plugin, an extension technically for Chrome called, I think it's called JumpCloud Go, which does a few different things. But among them is it allows in the managed profile that you have used to log into your, Google Workspace account connected to your business owner, to your organization, that combination of the extension and your profile allows the organization to identify when you go to websites that have single sign-on capabilities that you are not using, or when you go to a website which is outside of a list of prescribed desired relationships. So, for example, in JumpCloud's case, the administrators can periodically get a report of like, people are going to, 50 people out of 60 went to this website. You probably should consider, adding a contract or signing up for it, or at a minimum, you should communicate to your team if you want them to use a competitor, just know that they're using this product instead. And similarly, you can often find some new product that you've never heard of. Like, what is that? I don't know what that is. And you're like, oh, somebody's experimenting with Scribe. Okay, that's that's a LinkedIn kind of, content suggester. Okay, I guess that's something we should take a look at. I wonder why they're using that. What need is that solving? So there's a very interesting landscape happening, and by right now I mean literally like in the last 6 months. I think it's quite recent. Shadow IT has been around as a concept for a while, and a talking point, particularly it's often talked about from a security perspective, from this idea of like people have these accounts which are not connected to their kind of standard set of credentials. So it does mean in most cases that if a team member leaves your organization, then their shadow IT accounts are not automatically suspended or paused. The data in those is often separate from the rest of your data. So there are some ramifications there that are potentially kind of egregious and dramatic. But again, in my experience, at least, the vast majority of shadow IT stuff is either innocent or well-intentioned. And I do think it's important to approach that from a user experience perspective. Users are doing this typically because it solves a problem for them, not to make trouble for you. They're not doing it to be mean.
No, that's true. And it is mostly good intentions. But, good intention or usability is often the opposite of mitigating risks. So cybersecurity and usability are often not always friends.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different ways to describe the sort of the tension between sort of ease of access and
Yes.
security. I don't think there is an automatic correct answer to that question for any organization. I think it's a debate and a dialogue,
Yes.
and it should be a conversation among multiple people, not just the executives, but managers, and frankly, even the people who are actually kind of in the trenches doing the hands-on work. Nonetheless, classic examples are, and I think there's a trend generally towards, certainly in the States, I think probably everywhere, in Europe as well, towards certain kinds of security conventions becoming commonplace. 10 years ago, multi-factor was a relatively unusual thing to expect.
Yes.
And at this point, almost all major services of any great significance either have multi-factor or support some sort of single sign-on integration with some service that does provide multi-factor. And just to define, in case there's a person, multi-factor, of course, is the idea that your first factor is your password. You have a username and a password that allows you to connect. And then a second factor, a multi-factor, is something that you have, not something that you know. Traditionally, that is some sort of one-time keypad OTP, which is some sort of number that's generated when you initially kind of set up your account. You have this kind of synchronization between you and the kind of back-end system, so that usually it's a 6-digit number or 8-digit number kind of pops up, and you copy and paste that and use that as a secondary prompt. Interestingly, that kind of idea is something that dates all the way back to World War II. It was a common part of kind of like old school encryption. But I think also most people know it. In the old days, it was like you would get these little plastic fobs that would generate a series of numbers from particularly bank accounts. That was an area I found that European bank accounts were maybe a little more progressive than a lot of American ones, where I found those much more frequently in European bank accounts. You'd get a little fob that would generate a string of numbers. So in any case, those are now, in most organizations, those are typically handled with like an app on a phone or text messaging or sometimes even a push prompt. But in any case, that multi-factor is a great example, I would say, of a very vigorous and effective security tool that has gone from being kind of occasionally a source of conflict. 10 years ago, we would have frustrated conversations with CEOs or COOs or CFOs who would be like, I don't want to deal with this extra thing. And now I think most people have accepted that it's a thing it's required and it has significant benefits. It's also, there's a richer set of possibilities with password lists and all sorts of other kind of variations on that, physical keys. And there's a lot of kind of possible ways to solve that secondary factor problem in a way that hopefully works well for the people involved.
Yeah. I think this is a very good example about the acceptance of new tools. And now, if you imagine that you and I start a bank tomorrow and we do not multi-factor authentication, nobody will take you as serious anymore.
Yeah, very true.
Because this is now the status quo. This is the standard of cybersecurity, and that's a good thing. That's a good thing. Something else, Noah. If you work with both startups and bigger companies, multinationals. But also, if you focus on the startups, and in the US is the centerpiece of startups, especially in the technology space.
Yeah.
What kind of changes you recognize within your customers? Is the pace changing? For example, if you have a startup, you launch an online product, the entire world can be your hunting ground. How do you see this developing within your customers? And if you compare yourself as an entrepreneur in this space with this startup vibe, what's your view on this?
I think there's a few different kind of ways to approach that. We don't see a huge change in our customers or our particular clients, partially because I think our clients are a little larger and a little more established than where most of the dramatic change is happening. So I'm going to sort of sidestep the question and say, maybe this isn't true. I think this is probably not true of most of the people we work directly with. But what I see, I'm involved in a number of organizations where I talk to a lot of founders and talk to a lot more startups. And I do see that there's an explosion in startups in general. Obviously, we're in New York. Our office is on 11th Street. We're right near, just a few blocks from Union Square. There's really like a kind of an epicenter of, I think, dynamic activity in New York, also in California, and frankly, many other cities. But there's a very dynamic idea of people starting projects with extremely limited fiscal resources and extremely limited headcount. And I think some of that speaks to kind of some of the trend lines we spoke about earlier of consumerification of products. I think people will, there's a parallel process happening in the servicification. I'm not sure if that's a good word, but the idea that there are many more sort of business functions that instead of hiring a staff person to do, now you can, and many organizations will engage a company to provide as a product or as a service. And examples of that are, typically 10, 20 years ago, if you were doing a startup, one of your early hires would be an HR director or a people person or even a recruitment person, somebody who was dealing with the idea that you were going to like hire staff and also manage, frankly, the significant complexities involved in correctly navigating the both domestic and sometimes international kind of regulations around how you do that appropriately and ethically and legally. And now I think organizations will use things like Deal or JustWorks or POEs, co-employment organizations. So I think there's a very, very different landscape. In addition, I think it seems to me, this may not be, I can't back this up with statistics, but it seems to me that there's also a tendency for organizations to turn to other organizations for specific business needs that are even beyond that. An example of that would be maybe instead of hiring an SDR or a salesperson for outbound, they might use roughly the same amount of money or maybe a little less to hire a sort of like fractional chief marketing officer, or maybe they would hire a sort of an outbound SDR service, a marketing sales organization who, probably at this point is using some mixture of automation. Many of these are sort of, trying to leverage within their own verticals automation and workflows in order to optimize the amount of work they can do with the people they have. Also, hopefully improve quality, consistency, responsiveness. There's a bunch of other topics there that we could talk about. But I think that's a very interesting space. I know, for example, when I'm looking at like, we're doing this project, we have for example, an event series in our office, physically in our office, called Tata Tech, which is sort of me interviewing somebody in person. We have about 25 people, 30 people in the room. It's a very sort of small, intimate conversation. We mingle and have some cocktails and have some food for a half an hour, talk for about an hour, and then kind of people stand around and kind of share thoughts. And it's a chance to meet a very varied and diverse mix of individuals. And one of the things we've questioned is, so we do record these, and should our existing team take and generate blog posts, or should we hire an outside company that specializes in that? Similarly, I do interviews for this book that we've been working on, Tame the Tech Beast, and we keep wondering, should we hire somebody who specializes specifically in taking those interviews and turning those into something that's a little more accessible and a little more usable, or should one of our team do it? And I do see in the startup space definitely a tendency and a trend line towards engaging either kind of like agencies, a person who uses a mix of services, or in some cases, many startup founders I find just engage those services directly. There are so many of these SaaS services that do a pretty good job. It might not be quite as good a job as a person you would hire and engage to like specialize in that. But often you're like, that's good enough. I can the automation that thing produces is adequate. It's better than I could do myself. Sure, I'll do that. So I think that's a very interesting and slightly weird place we're in right now. Is saying, hey, it's good enough. I can produce something that looks professional enough for $100 a month as opposed to $2,000 a month.
Yeah, well. I can I see where you're coming from, because this is exactly what I'm doing as well. If I'm servicing my customers, and my bread and butter is sales mentoring and training, while I also see that a lot of companies who want to scale have the problem that they can hire somebody with all the regulations and all the needs and the costs, and how you can just outsource one aspect of this entire sales flow to somebody who's doing repetitive tasks, or using certain tools more often, how they can deliver more value in a shorter time period. And after a couple of months, if they grow, or a year, they can just decide to insource an SDR or a sales. How is this impacting Macktez? because I like the idea of inviting these kind of people and giving your brand some tangible brand, because you bring these people together.
Yeah.
How is this the next phase in your company?
It's a good question. We've spent a little bit of time and energy over the last couple of years experimenting with different kinds of inbound and outbound in marketing and sales. We spent most of our first 20 some odd years essentially without having any sort of formal sales structure. Like a lot of organizations of our size and type, the scale of referrals was and frankly, the scale and quality of referrals was good enough that there wasn't really anything. It was enough to just keep responding to referrals. That kept our pipeline full.
Yeah.
And we find what's happened over the last couple of years in particular is that we still get a lot of referrals, although we do less now than we used to. But our business changed, and we are kind of working with larger organizations on larger projects, and more of our referrals were coming in at the smaller end, basically the kind of work we used to do, not the kind of work we're doing as much of now. So in practical terms, that's caused us to have internal conversations about how to approach that, what to do. We actually have a fractional sort of salesperson who's working with us now. If you want to get into super nitty gritty, we did an experiment about a year ago with kind of outbound email, which was not terribly successful. We learned a lot and it was very interesting, but it didn't translate for our kind of business. We did another experiment about a year ago with outbound LinkedIn, which was also interesting and generated some very interesting conversations, but we concluded from both of those that those were not the right fit for us. And so we're now having our kind of outbound and our kind of efforts primarily centered on the book that I'm hoping we'll finish in the next month or so, Tame the Tech Beast, which is really a book about how to kind of think about technology in an organization that is looking around and saying, this doesn't seem right. This could be better, and how to approach that, how to as a larger organization, how to kind of figure out and chart a path out of this sort of tangled mess of things are not the way you want them to be to a better state. So between the book and the TED Tech, the event series we're doing, we're using both of those as opportunities to strike up conversation and hopefully kind of have some interesting conversations that maybe some of those translate into projects and opportunities. And also, frankly, selfishly, for me at least, both of those are areas that I find genuinely, sincerely interesting. And so, getting people to show up and come and talk at these things is a positive experience, regardless of if any sales or any opportunities come from them. So I do think that's the best possible scenario is that you genuinely enjoy the experience regardless of the outcome.
No, this is what I like. This is exactly the reason why we have this conversation, because I learned so much from you and also your background, and also see what the trends and developments are in your area. And yeah, if my prediction is right, in a couple of years we also see the saturation point of outbound systems, and then we go also to more personal things like creating a book, getting people together in a room. And this is, I think it is the thesis, the antithesis, and the synthesis that is coming
Absolutely.
together about AI, new tools, online and offline, but also maybe that people are more fractional, focusing on the things they're good at and providing value instead of the problems. You see, where is Macktez in 5 years from now?
That's a good question. Let me answer respond to your prior point, because I think that there's something super interesting in that, but I may ask you to remind me about the 5-year question in a moment. I think that there's something very interesting happening. I was given a book by someone named Andy Elwood many years ago, who sort of a early startup person who did some really interesting work. And we were talking about scale and growth, and he'd sort of recommended this book. I think it's called Blow Up. And it was a book that talked a lot about this person had sort of inherited a wine store from his parents and grown it from like $1 million a year to $10 million a year, but he'd basically done it by vlogging. And this was a book that was sort of like scratched my head a little bit, and I was like, vlogging? Like, this seems like weirdly out of date. And over the course of the book, he addresses this, but really what he's saying is there's a series of these sort of trends. Something becomes very popular, and if you're an early vlogger, and you get lucky and you have a lot of enthusiasm and good content, then you become basically you become pseudo famous, you become well known, and this becomes a sort of free marketing tool. And it was really about using these like kind of cycles of some whatever the latest tool is, and it wasn't trying to tell you what the current version of that is, but kind of encouraging you to go figure out which that thing is. aspects of that, I kind of squirmed a little bit and was like, ooh, it's a little opportunistic and a little bit like just dumb luck. But I think what you're describing, or what you described a moment ago, this idea of like AI assisted or even driven outbound, the idea that there's like an AI tool that's like looking at somebody's LinkedIn and looking at their web presence and their social media and initiating a conversation based on some, synthesis of that information coupled with whatever problem statements you're trying to sort of fix or whatever sales you're trying to make. It feels like right now we're in a moment where that feels a little bit exotic and is like, oh, I'm actually getting these inquiries which are kind of surprisingly well aligned with my interests. I'm getting kind of inbound emails and LinkedIn where I'm like, oh yeah, I am looking for that. Oh, I am actually looking for a new couch. That's funny you mentioned that. Yeah. So there's an element to that is both sort of interesting, but I strongly suspect, like a lot of these, that there's an arc, and that there's a saturation and there's a point where people just become desensitized to that form of communication or that model. So it's an area that I'm a little skittish about. I have complicated feelings about what I think amounts to sort of like saturating people's inboxes and some of their kind of awareness. I think it's some of what social media has done, both in a terrible and maybe sometimes in a very gratifying way, by kind of like, sending people content that commands their attention. But I'm not entirely convinced that's a great thing for the people on the receiving end. Even if it feels good in the moment, it has some real profound problem. So I don't have answers in terms of what that means and where that goes in the next 6 months or a year, but I do suspect that the outbound email and outbound LinkedIn and some of these other, I am dubious that those will continue to be kind of fertile ground for very long. I think that the quantity, certainly the quantity of communications that I get now is an order of magnitude more than it was just a few years ago. Yes. And yes, many of those are better, but it's still sort of an enormous quantity, and many of them are not better. There's plenty of junk in the mix. And I can only imagine what the sort of the spam battle there is of getting those things into my inbox, and hopefully, tuning those and sort of getting the right people to respond to the right messages. So anyway, that's a bit of a long-winded kind of response, but I do think there's something very interesting happening in that space now. But I would be cautious about investing significant amount of time, money, and work and really learning that, because it feels like a very potentially short period of efficacy. Again, I wouldn't be surprised if a year from now we kind of shrugged and we're like, outbound email and outbound kind of AI assisted stuff doesn't really produce the results that we want anymore. No. Or if it does, it doesn't produce it in the target population. One of the issues for us, of course, is that our kind of business and our kind of relationships are very relationship based. Yes. People don't hire us based on kind of like an advertisement in the back of a magazine. They hire us because they have a very particular kind of problem to solve. And typically referrals were very good for us because people would turn to their friend and say, hey, I have this problem. How would you solve it? And he's like, oh, I worked with these guys called Macktez. You should call them. And so the vast majority of our relationships came through that. So part of what I see as our goal is to just sort of slightly increase the funnel of people who are aware of us. And so our marketing and communications is, from my perspective, in part about having the person, when he says, oh, I know these guys Macktez, to have that person be like, oh, I've heard that name. I know those people. I don't know a lot about them. I don't know that they're good, but you're vouching for them, but they're already familiar to me. And I think that's part of the kind of the goal of some of these projects, is to build authority, but also to just build awareness that we exist. And then hopefully over time, the person who is aware we exist and hears our name from a couple of different people is therefore much more likely to kind of poke around on our website or be like, actually, this case study that you have on, collaborative IT with Sonic Union, like that's really similar to what I'm looking for. And hopefully that's, continues to kind of pull them down the funnel into reaching out to us and initiating a conversation.
Yeah. That's a very, very good response, because it just touches strategically and also the operational things you are trying to focus or to achieve within Macktez. So your view is on the strategic part. Well, there's a certain saturation point in the use of AI tools, and if something is successful, you see a replication, exponentially growing, because if it's successful, then it will drops. But still, from an operational perspective, you also need to find new projects, because although all your customers are 100% satisfied, on a certain moment you have acquisitions, you have companies that move. So you have to also find your new ways to attract prospects and customers.
Absolutely. And to that end, actually, specifically, one of the things that is slightly tricky is, an MSP typically succeeds by essentially getting a client relationship and keeping them consistently over the long time. Whereas a technology consultancy typically engages, solves a problem, and then is done. So there's obviously a mixture of those is beneficial for us from a finance and operations perspective.
Yes.
But we also try to approach even our MSP relationships as sort of an evolving state. We worked with MakerBot, for example, for many years, for probably close to 5 years. And a big part of that relationship was about helping them train up their existing kind of IT team, helping them figure out when and how to hire an IT director, helping them manage a massive overhaul of their network and their on-prem infrastructure, how to manage their DR, disaster infrastructure, and then also eventually how to merge with Ultimaker, another company, European company as it happens, I think from the Netherlands. So it definitely was sort of a very interesting kind of like half-decade arc where our involvement shifted. And during periods, sometimes a few years at a time, we would provide MSP-style services to like monitor this or to manage these servers. But really, ultimately, our goal was to kind of constantly reevaluating what kind of support was best to help them as a business. And as of right now, we don't have any active projects with them. We still have conversations going, but we don't have any like actual MSP services. And I think that's a delicate element, from a pure CEO hat, I want, recurring revenue. That's ideal. But from a like actual conscientious caring about the outcome of the business, I want to recognize that sometimes the best thing for that company is to bring that in-house, to hire a person and to take that over. And I think that ebb and flow is a critical component to kind of good long-term kind of empathetic and frankly, being generous about trying to understand what that organization, what your client is best served by, and not just what works best for your bottom line.
Yeah. I fully agree. And this is, I listen to you carefully, and it's something of the culture of Macktez combined with the future goals. Yeah. You have seen a lot of things in the past decades. So where are you going as Macktez?
Yeah, 5 years to back to the
5
question
years
you asked
now,
that I sidestepped.
But maybe 3 years because things are moving so fast. Maybe 3 years is a good horizon.
Yeah. It's hard to tell 3 to 5 years. I don't know which is a more impossible answer. I do have a lot of conversations with people where I say, can you tell me 6 to 18 months, like what, half a year and a half? 3 to 5 years, again, a lot of fantasy involved when you're that far out, particularly in the technology world. I think the predictions / guesses is I think an organization like ours probably is part of a bunch of really interesting technology tools. In other words, there are real trends in identity providers, workstation management. A lot of those things tend to kind of roll up into larger clusters. Some of the best products are often ones that are not rolled up. So there's an interesting tension there. I think a lot of managed service providers are frustrated by products that were really good, getting bought by some PE company and then being less good or not giving the kind of support that they were hoping it would get. So there's definitely sort of an interesting tension over the next half a dozen years of how how dependent on those tools organizations like us are, and also how good and appreciated and sort of trusted those tools are. An example of that are, CrowdStrike, has this sort of super catastrophic, terrible incident. And in a different era, that company probably would have been, black tick on the name and people would have no longer bought it. But most people are in long-term contracts. And so they don't have a way to get out of that. They're already locked in. And it's also part of a larger group that does a bunch of other things. And so things that I, a few years ago would have thought would have been like the death of the company, the amount of bad PR would have been a catastrophe, ultimately has had, if not no effect, certainly no dramatic catastrophic effect. And I think that is one of the slightly darker sides of the industry, is that the products which are biggest are not necessarily the products which are best. A lot of the products that are most effectively kind of locked in through these kind of roll-ups, codependencies, contracts. It's something Microsoft was famous for doing for large swaths of its professional history. the idea that you would kind of lock people into semi-predatory contracts. So I think that there's a sort of slightly grim potential. The darker path would be that a lot of these organizations roll up into only 2 or 3 sort of titanic, enormous, giant kind of clumps, and then groups are sort of forced to choose which of the less good things that which of the least worst choice is the one they want. So that's the darker. I think the more positive is that hopefully we continue to see more layers and more abstraction happening so that there are more varied players, more small players. It's interesting to wonder a little bit about how discoverability happens. I think now I often find myself thinking, oh, I want to solve this kind of problem. And then I go off and I try to find, who are the 2 or 3. I was having a conversation about a nonprofit I work with just a few days ago where they are considering launching sort of a omni-channel social media kind of campaign. And the last time we did that for Macktez in the way that this organization was describing, we used Buffer, and somebody used another tool. And so we kind of had a conversation. I was like, what do people use for that now? And the person was like, well, I used Buffer. And I was like, me too, but that's like 10 years ago. There's probably different options. And so I started poking around, and there's like 30. There's like just an incredible number. And even just trying to figure out like how they differ and like which of these is the one we should try. And like that is a daunting process. It's an interesting thing to think about of like who and how do you figure out which of these SaaS products are good. There's also a little bit of a dark underbelly in this era of lovable and vibe coding. I think, you go to a website and you're like, oh, this product actually looks really good. It looks polished. It looks professional. Everything on this screen looks like something that's a fully established product that is, capable of supporting what I wanted to do. That doesn't actually mean that the behind the scenes is properly built. It doesn't mean there's a VP of engineering making intelligent choices about data. It could just mean that they used Lovable or some sort of vibe coding thing to essentially create something that looks and at first glance appears viable, but isn't. So the whole idea of like how you do due diligence on a SaaS product, I think is a very squirrely, tricky question that will be a big part of the conversation over the next few years.
Yeah. I listen to you, and I also immediately recognize the problems you just mentioned, because I come across to a lot of interesting offers as well, and it seems so interesting. But now all of a sudden, I see a lot of people are mentioned that they are data scientists, data engineers, all than nothing more than good at making prompts at AI and wrap it up. And as things can do, if you use certain tools, it can be it looks like it is just been there for years and years. So the next development is also that you go from Macktez also to the trusted advisor and to due diligence for companies who bring in shadow IT tools, who can be a major risk, because this is also contradicting cyber usability and cybersecurity, because it can be a bad product made by a vibe coder, or it can be bad actors who extract data.
Yeah. Due diligence is obviously due diligence has a very specific formal meaning in the IT landscape. It's like, you're a consultant who's brought in by a PE group in order to do due diligence that this SaaS product you want to buy is properly built. You hire somebody CTO or a fractional CTO to like actually go into the GitHub and, check all the code and actually do like, what is the DevOps infrastructure and like how's everything connected. That's a process which people do, but that's not something you can do when you're trying to buy for $20 a month, kind of a SaaS product. The equivalent to that of like, what does due diligence mean from a SaaS consumer, I think is a topic that I'm both curious and frankly a little nervous about. I think it's tempting to think, oh, we're going to do due diligence, but I don't think we have the access to do what I would call due diligence in those scenarios. The best thing we can do is really reputation comparison. Like, what do we know about these founders? What do we know about the people who put this together? And then 2, like, who do we know who uses it? But neither of those is actual due diligence. Those are only due diligence in the most sort of, it's like you have a friend who says, I want to date this guy. And you're like, I think he's fine. I haven't heard anything bad about him, but that's not due diligence. That's just like, the most cursory level of evaluation.
I like what you see. And I think you're from, then I'm getting back to the culture of Macktez. It's also partially because of you. Your natural curiosity can bring professionalism to the due diligence, but also curiosity towards new SaaS or other solutions, and advise your customers to do the right thing. Yeah.
I mean, I think a big part of that, obviously, is many of our team members have been with us for a very long time. Some of the names I mentioned earlier, our director of client services, depending on how you count, has been with us for 20 years. He did leave for about 10 years in the middle there, so 13, 14, but certainly has been with us for a very long time. Our CTO, well over a decade. Our client services coordinator, I think 13, 14 years. A bunch of our kind of engineers on the managed services side are well over 10 years. So there's quite a few people. I mean, we're a small group, but there's quite a few people that have been with us for a very long time. And I think one of the interesting elements is hoping some of those people change and evolve their interests over time, and some aspects of them, of course, are established and fixed. And so one of a good team, I think, works by finding the right balance between kind of trying new things and experimenting and looking for what's coming next, kind of counterbalanced on the other end by like, hold on, let's use the tried and true method. Let's wait to deploy this in production until we've actually had 6 months of testing data. Let's overlap these two. Let's use a prototype or a proof of concept and actually get real feedback before we try it on another client. So there's I think a lot of very appropriate tension for those two. It's somewhat like the convenience and security tension. I think there's one between kind of innovation and experimentation mixed with kind of stability and kind of like, you know, reliability. Something I talk about internally sometimes in conversations is, so you find this SaaS product and you think this is amazing. It's going to replace this person I had hired to do outbound research or something, and he was using Zoom info and blah blah blah. And so I end up like using Success AI or Apollo AI, and they have this AI tool set, and I use it, and I'm like, this isn't bad. I'm gonna try this. But then, of course, many of these products come and go in the space of less than a year. It's not unusual to have that company bought by someone else, and then that product feature disappears, or even just to have that feature cease to exist, as something Google, I think, has become unfortunately famous for, the Google graveyard. There's just like, you know, so many products where you're like, oh man, that was so good. I really wish Google Reader still existed, but you know, it doesn't. And that, I think, is one of the great conundrums of some of the SaaS space, is this dynamic opportunities are very sort of immediately, promptly, and readily available and usable. But that also unfortunately means that they might not be there in a month. I had a very negative experience on this with hiring a bookkeeping service that had an interesting kind of like semi-automated process where they were doing a bunch of ingest and then kind of using some AI tools to sort of tag a bunch of transactions. It actually was a really great interface. I was quite pleased with the product. It was very cost effective. And after working with them for about 6 months, I just looked around and I was like, I haven't got any update in a month. What happened? Poked around, and it turned out that they had completely shuttered and relaunched as a credit card of all things, but with no communication. I just at some point was like, they stopped charging me last month, but also where's our accounting data? And it was just like, poof, they had basically just like disappeared, relaunched as a new thing, and were completely unresponsive. I had backups in another system that were adequate, but we basically had to redo the books for the year because for that company just should have pivoted. And I was a little flabbergasted. I had what I thought was a reasonably personal relationship with the person who I think was the founder, who was actually a person I was communicating with, but I could never get them to respond to any emails, phone calls, Slacks, or texts after this transition happened. And I think it's good. It's a good warning to remember that when you're in these SaaS products, the data isn't really yours. The functionality certainly is variable, and it's unknown if it'll still be there in 6 months or a year.
And always have a backup plan. And also, now this is a perfect example of a learning experience you can use in your due diligence.
Yes,
Advising
absolutely.
your customer. Yeah.
In this case, we had used Xero for many years, and we had actually just deleted the Xero account a week or two before. Like literally, we had been like, okay, we're ready to go. We don't need it anymore. It's been 6 months. But luckily, for a bunch of reasons, we had backups and we were able to restore. And so it turned out that it was a relatively trivial thing to recover from, but it was a good warning sign of like, ooh, make sure you have a backup plan to your backup plan, and you wear suspenders and also braces, and also make sure that you've double checked that it's clipped on your belt before you walk out the door and all that stuff.
Yeah. It's nice. Very nice example. Noah, I've really enjoyed talking to you. Again, there's so many new insights. May I ask, when is your when you expect to publish the book?
We're hoping within the next month. I think realistically probably by the end of the year is probably better. We're currently working on, I think, the 8th revision. I think I suspect that maybe as a group, we're a little bit of a perfectionist streak. And so somewhere in here, I think I'm going to have to just put my foot down and be like, it's good enough. Let's do it. But yeah, we're doing the 8th rewrite right now because the team is an amazing group of people, but also very particular and some great writers. So the real answer is I think in December is the realistic goal.
Very good, very good. And I can imagine that you will celebrate this publication because it is a major milestone. Yeah, amazing, yes. Noah. And I like the idea also that you're transforming with your company constantly. And now also adding this personal touch, like the publishing of a book, on top of all your experience with SaaS application and the advice to your customers. Yeah, interesting. Noah, I would like to thank you again also for attending the podcast. I'll keep an eye on you and also on Macktez and also when you publish your book. Thank you for attending. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks.
Yeah. Me as well, Edwin. Thank you so much for the great questions. And I feel like we probably could have talked for another hour about some of those topics. So perhaps we'll have a part 2 some other time in the not too distant future.
Be careful what you wish for, because I was thinking the same thing. So many new topics to discuss with you. All right. Thanks, Noah. We'll keep in touch.
Excellent. Take care.
All right. Take care.